Today's subject is a man whose weathered face became a symbol of American grit, whose voice never needed to rise to command a room, and whose characters, weary cops, flawed heroes, and reluctant legends, spoke louder than any press tour ever could. Gene Hackman. He was the anti-star in a town of stars, the reluctant icon who walked into greatness not with charm, but with defiance. While his peers chased flashbulbs and blockbusters, Hackman built a career on quiet force, a slow-burning intensity that made Popeye Doyle immortal, that won him 2 Oscars, and that made audiences lean in instead of cheer. But behind the statues and tough guy roles was a man who carried deep scars, a childhood abandoned by his father, a reputation earned too late, and a family life lived almost entirely out of frame. While the world saw the hard-boiled detective and the tyrannical sheriff, 3 children simply knew him as Dad. Not the actor, not the legend, just the man who disappeared for months at a time, then came home with tired eyes and few words. He raised Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie in the shadows of stardom, trying to protect them from an industry that never stopped taking. His marriage of 30 years collapsed under the weight of silence and distance, and though he later remarried and found peace, the bond with his children was shaped not by red carpets, but by absences and quiet reconciliation. Today we uncover the story of Gene Hackman, and what happened to the 3 children of a man who mastered the art of disappearing, both on screen and at home. Christopher Hackman was the eldest of Gene Hackman's 3 children, born in the early 1960s during a time when his father was still hauling freight and taking nameless background roles just to make ends meet in New York. From the beginning, Christopher's childhood was framed by contradiction. A father who was physically present but emotionally locked in a daily battle to become someone, and a mother, Faye Maltese, who kept the household afloat while quietly enduring the slow evaporation of their marriage. As Gene Hackman rose from obscurity with Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 and exploded into stardom after winning the Oscar for The French Connection in 1971, young Christopher watched from the margins. By the time he was 10, his father's name was on billboards, but his voice was rarely heard at the dinner table. He didn't grow up under the glow of stardom. He grew up in its shadow, learning early that the man Hollywood adored was not the man who tucked him in at night. The first real rupture came during his late teens, around the time Gene was filming Superman 2. One night, father and son reportedly had a fight, loud, bitter, and never discussed again, that ended with Christopher dropping out of UCLA's film program. Without explanation, he moved to Seattle and began working quietly behind the scenes as a lighting assistant and camera operator on low-budget indie projects. Crew members from the 1980s recall a Chris M. on set, quiet, meticulous, and always evasive when asked about his family. What few realized was that Chris M. was actually Christopher Hackman, son of a 2-time Academy Award winner. He had not only changed his professional name, he had deliberately erased the connection. He never leveraged the Hackman name. He never called in favors. He refused with quiet conviction to inherit the pedestal. By the 1990s, as Gene Hackman entered the final triumphant phase of his career, Unforgiven, the firm Crimson Tide, Christopher had retreated further from the film world. Living in rural Oregon, he worked on regional television crews, wrote ad copy for local businesses, and eventually moved again. This time to Montana, where he reportedly volunteered at a center for at-risk youth and children on the autism spectrum. A rare 2006 interview in a small-town magazine would mark the only public comment he ever made about his father. Fame cost him more than it gave him. I just didn't want the same deal. That single sentence said more than a memoir ever could. Christopher Hackman never published a tell-all. He never gave interviews to Vanity Fair or appeared at Lifetime Achievement galas. He didn't show up at premieres or pose on red carpets. But in choosing anonymity over legacy, distance over entitlement, he made a powerful statement. Some children of fame don't want to carry the torch. They want to bury it. His story isn't a Hollywood tragedy or a redemption arc. It's something rarer. The quiet rebellion of a son who watched the spotlight burn and chose the shade. Elizabeth Hackman was the middle child of Gene Hackman and Faye Maltese. Born into a family already fraying at the seams, where love was real but routinely drowned out by distance, silence, and career ambition. Unlike her older brother Christopher, who grew up alongside Jean's early struggles, Elizabeth arrived as her father was cementing his legend. She was a toddler when the French Connection made him a household name, and still in grade school as roles in The Conversation, Night Moves, and Superman turned her father's name into industry shorthand for grit, gravitas, and restrained rage. But while audiences saw a man in control, Elizabeth saw a father stretched thin who could go from total absence to total intensity in a single weekend home from set. The house wasn't filled with Hollywood parties. It was filled with schedules, half-packed suitcases, and the quiet exhaustion of a man who had given his best self to the camera. And so, Elizabeth became what many daughters of powerful men become: the quiet observer, the emotional antenna in a family built on restraint. Unlike Christopher, Elizabeth never tried to run from the family name, but she never embraced it either. As a teen in the 1980s, she flirted with the arts, some theater workshops, a semester studying literature, even a brief stint assisting on a film set where her father had connections. But she quickly recoiled from what she called, in a letter to a friend later leaked online, a world where sincerity is just another form of currency. By the time she was in her 20s, she had left California entirely, enrolling in a graduate psychology program in Colorado under her mother's maiden name. She later became a therapist, not in Los Angeles or New York, but in a mid-sized town where most of her clients didn't even know who her father was. That choice wasn't accidental. It was self-preservation. Because as much as she respected his talent, Elizabeth carried the memory of a man who could dominate a room with charm and vanish from his daughter's life for months with no warning. She once told a colleague, "He taught me what presence feels like, mostly by not giving it." But the twist in Elizabeth's story came years later, when she unexpectedly found herself the emotional anchor between her two brothers. After their parents divorced in 1986, the family's already fragile bond all but collapsed. Christopher retreated in isolation, and Leslie, the youngest, spiraled into a long cycle of self-doubt and reinvention. Elizabeth, the one who had never sought a spotlight, became the only sibling who kept consistent contact with both parents. She would send postcards to her father even when he didn't respond, mediate phone calls between her mother and brother, and quietly visit her father's second wife, Betsy Arakawa, just to keep things human. Those who know her describe Elizabeth as the emotional glue of a family that rarely acknowledged emotion at all. She never wrote a memoir, never gave a televised interview, and never used her father's legacy for personal leverage. But in many ways, Elizabeth Hackman inherited the hardest role of all. Not the rebel, not the star, but the quiet reconciler. The one who understood that behind every complex man is an even more complex silence. And behind that silence are the daughters who learn to translate absence into strength. Leslie Hackman, the youngest of Gene Hackman's three children, entered the world in the early 1970s, a decade when her father's face was on every movie poster, but rarely at the kitchen table. Born at the peak of his fame, Leslie grew up in a world where her last name opened doors she never asked to walk through, and where the man on the screen, explosive, magnetic, commanding, bore little resemblance to the quiet, tired figure who occasionally showed up at home. As a child, Leslie was the most sensitive of the three, clinging to her mother Fay Maltese for structure while simultaneously reaching toward a father who was always out of reach. The rare weekends when Gene returned from set were marked not by chaos but by silence, his exhaustion palpable, his attention fragmented. Leslie would later describe these visits as feeling like someone famous came to your house, but no one told you it was your dad. In school, Leslie was artistic, expressive, and quietly rebellious. She loved photography and wrote poetry about people who disappeared. While her brother Christopher fled Hollywood and her sister Elizabeth rejected it, Leslie spent her late teens wandering in its margins, attending gallery openings, working briefly as a production assistant on indie films, and trying to figure out if there was space for someone like her in an industry obsessed with polish. She didn't chase stardom, but she was drawn to the fringe, the part of the creative world where vulnerability wasn't punished, and famous last names weren't the only currency. Yet her lineage followed her. Directors would ask about Gene. Producers would hint at doors she could walk through if she just played the game. And every time she got close to saying yes, she would pull back. Self-sabotage, some said. But for Leslie, it was self-preservation. The twist in Leslie's life came in her mid-20s when her parents' divorce, finalized years earlier, finally caught up with her. While Elizabeth had absorbed the family's emotional weight and Christopher had disappeared into anonymity, Leslie spiraled. She moved frequently, changed jobs often, and entered a brief, volatile marriage that ended within a year. For a time, she cut off contact with her father completely. In her own words, shared in a private letter leaked by a former friend, she wrote, "Everyone wants Gene Hackman, the legend. I just wanted a dad who showed up to my play in high school." That same year, she entered therapy and began working as an arts educator for at-risk youth in San Diego, a job she described as the opposite of acting. It's about showing up, not performing. In the decades since, Leslie has remained deliberately under the radar. She's never published a book, never spoken publicly about her father, and avoids interviews. But her life in many ways represents the deepest reckoning with Gene Hackman's legacy. While Christopher ran from the name and Elizabeth held the family's emotional threads, Leslie confronted the emptiness head-on. The absence, the disappointment, the quiet pain of being the child left behind, not by scandal, but by career. And in confronting it, she carved out something entirely her own. A life built not in reaction to fame, but in rejection of its terms. 3 children, 3 different paths, and one towering father whose most lasting imprint may not have been on cinema, but on the silences his children had to learn how to fill. Each lived a different version of what it meant to be a Hackman, not by choice, but by inheritance. Their father gave the world unforgettable characters. They gave him something more human, distance, forgiveness, and a truth that never made it to the screen. If you found this story meaningful and want more deep dives into the hidden lives behind America's most iconic families, subscribe to Legacy Uncovered. Your support helps bring the unseen side of fame to light. Thanks for listening.